Hey, Clayton, why is avoiding yeast such a big deal in Exodus and Leviticus? It comes up a lot, like it's something God really, really doesn't want in his presence. Why does God hate yeast? Okay, there's a few answers to this question. You probably noticed this. It's kind of one of those, repeated word kinds of things that in certain passages, it seems like he just keeps saying it again and again. There are actually two different situations that we're talking about with this. One is with the Passover meal, and one is during ordinary offerings, okay? So during the Passover meal, God says, I don't want you to use any yeast in your bread, okay? And the reason for that is because the Passover was a hasty departure, okay? They're leaving Egypt. They're escaping from slavery, and God's going to do it over the course of one night. And so he basically says, all right, this is it, when they're still in Egypt. He says, I want you to eat with your clothes on, with your bags packed, with your belt around your waist. I want you to go fast, okay? Only make as much food as you need. You're not carrying stuff with you. And I want you to make bread without yeast because you don't have time to let it rise, okay? You can make it's a quick bread that you can make, and you can just kind of have it ready to go, and you won't be spending extra time getting out of here by doing that. That was the idea behind that. So every time when the Passover comes up, they continue to eat that way as a way to put themselves back in that situation, to say, we're going to remember when our ancestors had to escape from Egypt quickly, and this is the way they did it. When it comes to the offerings, we're talking about not the Passover meal in your home. We're talking about the offerings in the tabernacle or the temple. God says, for certain offerings, I want you to bring me grain, okay? So some of the offerings, the sacrifices, were animals that were killed. Others were things that were grown in their field, okay? So they would actually take the grain and they would make kind of a little piece of bread, and they would offer it on the altar as their offering, some of these things. And most of these were a way of saying thank you. They're offering tribute to God, an expression of gratitude for what he'd provided. But in those offerings, God said, I don't want you to make any of them with yeast. And here's the thing. No explanation is given for why that's the case. We can try to piece some things together, but we don't just have an answer in the Bible where it says, well, here's the reason why. So people speculate about this. One thing I would probably rule out, okay, it is not likely related to either the chemical or biological composition of the yeast. It's probably not some scientific explanation that the Israelites wouldn't have known, right? So sometimes people will speculate, well, maybe yeast has got this property or that property that we know about because of modern science, and God knew that, so he excluded it for this reason. I don't think that's the case. I think it would have made sense to the Israelites. They would have intuitively said, okay, that's a thing that makes sense to us. And the author of the original audience would have said, oh yeah, I know why. I don't want to attribute things and say, well, it was because of the secret reason we didn't know for another, 1900 years or more than that after them, okay? So I don't think it has to do with kind of the chemical, biological side of yeast. It could be that it's simply a clean, unclean rule, okay? The clean, unclean rules all throughout the Bible, all throughout the Leviticus in particular, are saying there are certain things that are appropriate for God's presence and certain things that are not. Now, some of those we can figure out touching a dead body, right? Death is not something that makes sense in God's presence, so it's excluded. Other things where there is disease or loss of life or those sorts of things, it makes sense that you'd say, this is not appropriate or presentable in God's presence because his presence is full of life and full of wholeness and so on. There are other things, though, that are a little harder to figure out. Certain things that we say, we don't know why God designated that clean or unclean, but it was a way of saying, here's kind of the decorum. You almost think about it, if you say there's a dress code in a certain place, or you say, if you present before the Supreme Court, there are certain ways you speak to, a justice, or a certain way that you dress, or a certain way that you pose your statements and that sort of thing. It's not because this is a moral rule. It's because it's a rule of saying in certain places, certain things are presentable and make sense, and it shows respect to the leader that you're talking to, or so on, to do things the right way. We talk about if you're at a funeral or a wedding, there are certain things that are perfectly acceptable in most places in life, but you wouldn't do there because you're respecting what's going on in that context. And so this could be that sort of thing where it's one of those rules. Why no yeast? Well, God said it's just not acceptable in this place, even though you can eat yeast, whenever you want in your home, right? So it could just be one of those sorts of things. There are other places in the Bible, and I think this may have something to do with it, where yeast is used as a symbol of sin. or of false teaching, okay? And the idea, the image there is that sin and false teaching gets in the mix of things and spreads and fills and grows, and you don't want that, right? And so there are times when later in the Bible, yeast is used as a symbol for that. Now, the tricky part is yeast is also used as a symbol of good things. Jesus uses the image of yeast to describe the kingdom of God working its way through the world in all these small and little ways that seem inconspicuous and unimportant, but all of a sudden it grows and expands, and suddenly it's influencing and filling all sorts of things. And so there are good and bad imagery associated with yeast. So it may be that the symbol of sin is associated with the yeast, and so God doesn't want it, but we just don't know for certain. And it's also worth noting there were some forms of offerings where yeast was allowed. So it wasn't completely forbidden, but the primary types of offerings included that, but there were some kind of free will, first fruits kinds of offerings where yeast was allowed. So we don't actually know. So there are times in the Bible when we just don't have the answer, and that's okay. We don't need an explanation for everything. Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.